Welcome back to the Amlet podcast, where I sometimes read, but also talk about literature for students who want to listen along. So, we're continuing our journey through the Navajo Creation Story in episode 11 at present. And in our previous episode, First Man, First Woman, the Holy People, and First Angry created the stars and constellations of the night sky with a little bit of order and a little bit of chaos. As you'll see in your digital copy of your story, we are skipping the recreation of the sacred mountains for time's sake. But essentially, the sacred mountains were recreated in the fourth world from the third world, if you remember, giving the people a homeland full of direction, ceremony, and memory. It felt to me like we've arrived at the we're finally home part of the story with the recreation of the mountains because there seems to be more stability and meaning making going on, but the fourth world is not yet free. Not yet free from the consequences of the world below. During the long separation of men and women in the third world, several women attempt to meet their sexual needs through objects taken from animals, plants, and the earth. Now, after emergence, children were conceived during that period, and they are being born now. These children are physically unusual, and the community responds to them with fear. Rather than raising them, the people abandon them. Each survives, grows beyond the community's control, and becomes a monster of sorts. So I will warn you now that the content within this installment alludes to mildly upsetting sexually deviant behaviors. Please know that while you may experience some temporary discomfort, each unpleasant detail is a necessary part of the story and will resolve by the end. So, as you listen through this episode, ponder a question for me. What happens when a community tries to abandon the consequences of its past? That's a big one. What happens when a community tries to abandon the consequences of its past? So feel free to read along in your own copy and take notes where you feel like you'll need the reminder for your upcoming assignments. So let's begin in the first paragraph. In the third world, there was a time when men and women had lived apart for a long time. During that time, some women had used animal horns or long stones or bird feathers for sex. Now, in the fourth world, some of these women were pregnant. One woman who had used an antelope horn gave birth to a child with no head. The people held a council and decided that this baby would be abandoned. It was left to die in a gully, but it lived and grew to become the horned monster. So the narrative immediately returns to the separation of men and women. Although that conflict ended in reconciliation, its consequences did not end when the people crossed the river or entered another world. The pregnancies carried the history of the third world into the fourth. And this passage describes the sexual acts plainly without romanticizing them. And the problem here is that the children were conceived during a period of prolonged separation, loneliness, and imbalance. The story now links those actions to the kind of what appears to be those who are unfit for the community and their expectations of human form. So they're having to learn a new lesson and confront the unknown. The first child is born without a head after the mother used an antelope horn. Its body reflects the object involved in its conception. The antelope horn becomes part of the child's identity and later gives the monster its name. So, to respond, the people hold a council intended to make a communal decision about this horror. And instead of an impulsive act of, kind of one frightened parent. The child is left in a gully to die, but it survives, and the landscape becomes its refuge when the community refuses to provide one. It eventually grows into the horned monster, developing outside human care, and returns in a more dangerous form. That's a hard one to take in. It will continue to be a little bit uncomfortable, but I hope you'll stick with me. Let's continue with our text. A woman who had used an eagle's feather for sex gave birth to a round, headless child with feathered shoulders. A council was held, and it was decided that this baby too should be abandoned. It was left in an alkali pit, but it lived and grew to become Monster Eagle. It made its home on a peak beyond the La Plata Mountains. So here we have a second child born headless, and its shoulders are covered with feathers. Again, the child's body reflects the material associated with its conception. A council is held once more, and we start to see a pattern. There's a birth, the fear, the collective judgment, abandonment, survival, and transformation. The child is left in an alkali pit, and it's kind of like this hard and barren location, suggesting that the people intended to place it where survival appears impossible. Yet the child survives and becomes Monster Eagle, later making its home on a distant peak. Elevation suits the creature's connection with the eagle, and the mountains, especially this particular mountain, gives it distance and visibility and control over the land below. So as the monsters emerge, they are also assigned to geography. Each occupies a particular place beyond the central homeland, and the landscape begins to contain zones of danger as well as zones of divinity in the sacred mountains. And I don't know about you, but this is getting a little stressful. So let's see what happens next. Continue to kind of push through this and follow along with me. A woman who had used an elongated stone for sex gave birth to a headless child with hard skin and a pointed neck. The people met in a council and decided that this baby should be abandoned in a fissure in a cliff. They placed the child and closed the fissure with rocks, but the child lived and grew to become the monster who kicks people down the cliff. It made its home at a place beyond the mountains. The third child has hard skin and a pointed neck, and that echoes the long stone involved in its conception. Its body appears mineral rather than soft and vulnerable like human skin. The people again meet in council and decide to abandon it. But this time they place the child inside a fissure and close the opening with rocks. The act resembles a burial or like an imprisonment. The people are attempting to steal the child within the landscape, but the cliff does not destroy it. Instead, the place of abandonment becomes connected to the monster's later power. It grows into the being who kicks people from cliffs. And although that is probably horrifying for some of us, and maybe even for the Navajo, but it's it's a little funny to me, because I imagine that um, it's like equal retribution for how this particular child was abandoned, and it's like it's poetic justice. This monster also lives beyond one of the sacred mountain regions, and the description maps danger at the edges of the known world. So more and more danger. The next section can be a little off-putting, so continue to bear with me. A woman who had skinned a sour cactus and used it for sex gave birth to twins. headless creatures with no limbs. They had two depressions at the top that looked like eyes. The people gathered and decided that these infants had to be abandoned. They threw them as far as they could, but the twins found shelter in a brush and survived. They grew to become monsters that kill with their eyes. So, this fourth birth produces twins without limbs or hands, but just two depressions resembling eyes. Their strange appearance again frightens the community, and the people decide to literally throw them away. So, unlike their earlier children, these infants are not placed in a specific pit or an opening. They are cast as far from the community as possible. The attempt at distance fails, of course, and the twins find shelter in brush and survive. Their development into monsters who kill through sight introduces this incredibly new form of danger. They don't need claws, they don't need horns, they don't need physical strength because their power is located in a gaze. The eye-like depressions noted in their birth become the source of their adult identity. So, as in the previous sections, a feature of the people initially find disturbing becomes magnified into supernatural power. So, chew on that. How much these councils and humans are contributing to the transformations and the monster and the danger because of how they have responded to abjection. The twins also echo the story's recurring use of paired beings. Elsewhere, twins and male female pairs supported creations and balance, and this pair in particular is going to be destructive. Kind of the opposite. So let's continue with the text. One monster came about in a different way. A woman named Loose Running Woman went off alone in the direction of the sunrise. After defecating, she used a smooth pebble from the river to clean herself. She placed the warm stone in her genitals just as the sun rose above the horizon. Seeing this, the sun sent a ray into her. In only 9 days, she gave birth to a large child. Having no husband and not knowing who the father of the child was, she abandoned the child in a rocky place. But the sun knew that the baby was his, and he protected it from afar, but never visited it. The child grew to be large and powerful and very angry. It was called Big Giant by the people. Right? It's like these monsters develop even more, and maybe you see a little bit of, sort of a virgin birth of sorts in this story, as well as we would know with the Christian tradition. So the narrator signals that this monster has a different origin. Unlike earlier children, Big Giant is not conceived during the separation of men and women. His birth involves a woman, literally called Loose Running Woman, in the sun. Loose Running Woman travels alone toward the sunrise, and her direction places her in the path of the newly created sun. The account combines bodily action, landscape, and cosmic power as a river stone, warmed by her body, becomes the point through which the sun sends a ray. The pregnancy lasts only 9 days. The compression period marks the child as extraordinary from the beginning because it does not follow the ordinary gestation for humans. And because Loose Running Woman has no husband and does not understand the child's origin, she abandons him. Her decision differs somewhat from the council decision because she acts alone and without knowledge of a father. The son knows that the child is his, and he protects him from a distance without visiting. This distance Distant protection allows the child to survive, but does not provide any sort of companionship or instruction or sense of belonging. The child grows larger, powerful, and angry as a result in his isolation. And now we move to the final short paragraph of this section about monsters. The monsters hid along paths and killed and devoured travelers. They killed many people, and the people began to live in fear. The monsters moved from isolated places into traveler routes, which just got closing in. They hide along paths, and they that connect homes and communities and water sources and hunting areas and ceremonial places. So this disrupts everything about their lives and just how they move about in the day and seasonally. The people can no longer assume that any place is safe. The children who were once created as threats, or excuse me, the ones that were treated as threats become actual threats. The episode ends with fear spreading through the population, and their presence alone changes how everyone lives. And so the children are rejected because they're headless, limbless, feathered, hardened, pointed, or just otherwise unusual. And because of their acts of abandonment by the community, they participate in the conditions that make these children monsters. The story here does not remove the real danger the monsters later pose, nor does it offer a simple lesson about acceptance. It preserves the tension between the fear of the unfamiliar and the responsibility toward vulnerable life. Furthermore, the once sacred mountains and their peaks and gullies, pits, fissures, brush, cliffs, and path now house danger. Considering the consequences they're reaping from their actions in the third world, a community may repair a relationship and still need to address what happened while that relationship was broken. There's a lot of responsibility that comes from those broken relationships. And they add fuel to the fire by casting away what they do not understand. Furthermore, although First Angry Coyote does not appear in this episode, the monsters resemble the larger pattern associated with him. They introduce unpredictability into a world the people have tried to make ordered. Like Coyote's earlier actions, their origins lie in unresolved imbalance. But unlike First Angry, they don't speak, they don't negotiate, or explain themselves in this section. They're simply direct physical threats. The narrative is now moving toward sort of this new phase. So we've created homes, we've got calendars, we've got stars and mountains and ceremonies, but now they are going to need protection. And as we finish this episode, think back to the original question that I posed. What happens when a community tries to abandon the consequences of its past? Well, maybe we can say that distance and exposure do not end a problem. Eventually, as we've seen, those unresolved distances return as predators, either literally or figuratively. We cannot ignore what we don't understand. So thank you for listening to this episode of the AMLIT podcast. In our next episode, there's hope in the forthcoming Monster Slayer twins. So I will see you soon. And until then, take care.